Welcome back, everyone. Tonight, we're not stepping into a dusty textbook or trudging through another list of kings, queens, and battle dates. Instead, we're going somewhere far more personally to the messy, unpredictable, and sometimes downright hilarious world of medieval love and dating. Because while empires were rising and armies were clashing, ordinary people were still trying to answer one timeless question. How on earth do you find love? Picture this. The year is 1347. You're standing in a crowded village marketplace. The smell of bread mixing with wood smoke, and you catch someone's eye across the stalls. Maybe it's a baker as apprentice, balancing a tray of pies, or a noblewoman gliding past in silk. Your heart skips a beat, but then reality sets in. Love in this world isn't just about butterflies. It's about dowries, alliances, church rules, and 100 pairs of eyes watching your every move. One wrong glance could turn into 6 weeks of gossip at Sunday Mass. Talk about pressure. And yet, despite all the rules and restrictions, people still tried. They exchanged the tokens of ribbon, a glove, a piece of embroidery, small objects loaded with enormous meaning. They sneaked glances, scribbled poems, bribed servants to deliver secret notes. And for those bold enough to imagine something more, courtly love took the stage. This was love as performance art. Knights pledging devotion to married ladies, poets singing about longing that could never be fulfilled, and a constant dance between desire and duty. It was impractical, exhausting, and sometimes ridiculous, but it was also deeply human. That's the beauty of history. When we zoom in, we realize that no matter how different the setting, whether you be in a medieval castle with stone walls or a modern apartment, swiping through dating apps, the human desire for connection remains the same. The awkwardness, the thrill, the heartbreak, the joy. Those haven't changed in 700 years. What has changed is the backdrop. Instead of smartphones, you had parchment. Instead of emojis, you had symbolic gifts. Instead of texting, what are you doing? At 2 a.m, you had to risk sending a poem to a minstrel in the town square. Over the course of this video, we're going to explore not just how people courted and married in medieval Europe, but what those rituals reveal about society itself. We'll talk about love songs, arranged marriages, dowries, and even a few scandals that would make modern tabloids look tame. Along the way, I'll share stories that bring these practices to life and add some of my own thoughts on what we can learn from them today. But before we dive deeper into this journey, I'd like to ask a small favor. If you enjoy exploring history in a way that feels alive, relatable, and sometimes even a little funny, then please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps more people find these stories and keeps this community growing. If you'd like, drop a comment letting me know where you're rewatching from it. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. So, dim the lights, settle in, and let's step into the strange, surprising world of medieval dating, a world where love was never simple, but always unforgettable. If you were a young man or woman in the Middle Ages, stepping into the world of courtship was less like entering a romantic adventure, and more like walking onto a stage where every gesture was scrutinized, every word carried meaning, and every decision was bound by customs that seemed designed to keep love on a leash. The very idea of romance existed under layers of expectation, with family, community, and church authorities all playing invisible yet powerful roles in shaping who you could love, how you could express it, and whether that affection was destined to blossom into marriage or vanish under the weight of disapproval. Unlike the stories we might imagine, where two hearts meet by chance and immediately chart their own path. In medieval society, love was rarely a private matter. Every action was observed, whether in a village square, at a feast, or even during a short walk through the fields, and the presence of watchful eyes meant that genuine affection had to disguise itself as polite conversation, subtle glances, or carefully orchestrated exchanges. To show open interest was risky. To meet alone was almost unthinkable. To pursue passion without permission was to invite scandal, and scandal in this world was not a passing whisper, but a stain that could follow you for years. The rules were not written down like modern laws, but they were enforced with the same seriousness, woven into the very fabric of daily life. A nobleman's daughter could not simply fall for the charming apprentice at the mill, for her hand represented wealth, alliances, and future influence, not fleeting attraction. A knight could not simply declare his feelings to any woman he pleased, for doing so might risk dishonor, especially if the lady was already bound by marriage. Even the simplest tokens of affection, like a shared smile or a ribbon exchanged in passing, were acts of daring, charged with layers of meaning that could either ignite hope or unleash a torrent of gossip. And yet, within all this complexity, people still searched for connection. They carved out tiny moments of possibility, slipping words of admiration into the pauses of conversation, sending messages through trusted intermediaries, or relying on poetry and song to say what could not be spoken openly. These rituals created a world where romance was not a straightforward pursuit, but a careful game of patience and wit, where even the most innocent encounter could ripple outward into consequences far larger than the two people involved. To us today, it might seem suffocating, even unfair, that love had to bow to the heavy hand of tradition and social order. But to those who lived it, these rules were as natural as the seasons. They were not seen as obstacles so much as boundaries, and within those boundaries, men and women found creative ways to express longing, desire, and loyalty. It was a dance as much about survival as about affection, a delicate balance of emotion and caution, where the heart's impulses could never entirely silence the voice of duty. In the midst of all these restrictions, there emerged a curious cultural phenomenon that transformed the way love was spoken about and celebrated, not through secret meetings or private gestures, but through a ritualized form of admiration that was carefully constructed, endlessly performed, and often deliberately kept apart from the physical realities of romance. Known as courtly love, it became one of the defining features of medieval culture, not because it gave people freedom to pursue passion, but because it offered an arena in which longing itself could become art, where desire could be wrapped in verse, song, and noble gestures, elevated into something that seemed almost sacred in its unattainability. At its core, courtly love was never truly about fulfillment. It was about demonstrating devotion with such intensity and such elegance that the act of coning became more important than the possibility of union. A knight might swear loyalty to a lady far above his station, often one who was already married, and rather than seeking to cross that boundary, he would use his longing as a source of inspiration, composing poetry, performing brave deeds in her honor, and carrying her favor into tournaments, as though her smile alone could shield him from the blows of his opponents. The lady in turn might encourage this attention in subtle ways, granting a token, offering a word of kindness, but she was not expected to return his love in the earthly sense. Her role was to stand as an ideal, a figure of virtue and grace, someone whose unattainability was precisely what made the devotion so powerful. To modernize, it may seem puzzling, even contradictory, that a culture so tightly bound by rules against open romance should simultaneously celebrate a tradition that thrived on the tension of impossible love. Yet, that paradox was exactly what gave courtly love its strength. It was a safe way to channel longing, a socially sanctioned theater of emotion where everyone knew the boundaries and yet found pleasure in stretching them through performance. The poems of troubadours, the ballads sung in great halls, the whispered verses exchanged in gardens, all of these were not confessions meant to overturn society's norms, but rather elaborate performances meant to play within them, to express what could not be lived, to transform private feeling into public art. What makes this tradition so fascinating is that it tells us as much about the society as it does about the individuals, a placing love on a pedestal, out of reach and untouchable. Medieval culture created a kind of emotional spectacle, one that emphasized admiration over intimacy, loyalty over indulgence, restraint over satisfaction. It was a way of dignifying longing, of making the act of wanting itself a virtue, and of turning the private stirrings of the heart into a public display of refinement and culture. The knight did not simply desire his lady. He sought to prove through his behavior, his poetry, and his courage that he was worthy of feeling that desire at all. And in doing so, he reinforced a very social order that seemed to stand in the way of love. For by never breaking its rules, he transformed yearning into obedience and affection into art, while courtly love unfolded like a grand performance designed to stir hearts and inspire poetry. The reality of marriage in the medieval world was grounded in concerns far more practical, often dictated not by personal choice, but by the weight of family ambition, political necessity, and economic survival. For most people, particularly among the nobility and wealthy merchant classes, marriage was not the culmination of a romantic journey, but rather a carefully negotiated contract, an alliance intended to strengthen bloodlines, consolidate land, or secure financial stability. Love, if it came at all, was expected to grow afterward, quietly and without interfering with the obligations that the union had been designed to fulfill. Families would gather around tables strewn with parchments and seals discussing terms that treated the bride and groom less as individuals with hopes and fears and more as pieces on a board, tokens to be moved strategically to secure the future of estates or to resolve long-standing rivalries between households. A noble daughter might be promised to a powerful lord, decades her senior, in order to expand her family's influence, while a young heir could find himself bound to a bride whose dowry of land and coin outweighed any consideration for personality or appearance. Even among common folk, where wealth and titles were less at stake, marriages were still shaped by family arrangements, with parents seeking to ensure that their children married into households that could provide stability, security, and the promise of survival in a world where life was uncertain and resources often scarce. The ceremony itself, cloaked in religious solemnity and sanctioned by the church, might appear on the surface to be a celebration of union. Yet, beneath the hymns and blessings lay the heavy truth that the marriage was above all a contract witnessed by family, neighbors, and God, and designed to uphold the order of society. Young couples might smile dutifully as vows were spoken, but often their hearts carried a mixture of resignation, apprehension, and in some cases, quiet rebellion. For even in a world so carefully ordered, the human spirit did not always surrender easily to arrangements that ignored personal desire. Yet, it would be too simple to say that love never entered these unions, for history reveals countless examples where affection grew in unexpected ways, where companionship, respect, and even passion managed to blossom within marriages originally forged for advantage rather than feeling. Over time, shared experiences, the raising of children, and the trials of daily life could transform what began as a calculated match into something more tender, proving that while society might dictate the terms of union, it could not entirely extinguish the possibility of genuine connection. Still, for many, the first step into marriage was not a leap into romance, but a submission to duty. And that reality shaped not only individual lives, but the structure of entire communities, binding families together into networks of obligation and influence that stretched across generations. Even within the weight of family contracts and the solemn obligations of marriage, people still found ways to nurture the spark of affection. In one of the most enduring traditions of medieval romance was the quiet exchange of tokens, objects so small that they could be hidden in the folds of a cloak or the palm of a hand, yet so meaningful that they carried the weight of an entire unspoken conversation. A simple glove, a piece of ribbon, or a delicately embroidered kerchief might seem ordinary to anyone else, but for the giver and the receiver, these items became secret symbols of devotion, carrying within them the thrill of longing and the risk of discovery. To present such a gift was rarely a casual gesture. It was a carefully considered act that demanded courage, for to offer something tangible was to make one's feelings known in a society where direct words of passion were often impossible. A knight might kneel before a lady and ask for a favor before riding into a tournament, and if she offered him a ribbon from her gown or a strip of lace tied to his arm, that fragment of fabric became a talisman, a visible declaration that he fought not only for honor, but also for the acknowledgement of her presence in his life. Likewise, a young woman might slip a glove into the hands of her admirer, trusting that he would recognize the gesture as a promise of loyalty or as a silent encouragement to continue his pursuit. These tokens carried a significance far beyond their material worth, for they were not just objects, but messages encoded with meaning that outsiders might overlook yet, which could set two hearts racing with anticipation. A flower pressed between the pages of a book, a clasp left behind after a visit, even a strand of hair tied with thread. Of these became part of a secret language of love, a way of weaving intimacy into daily life without ever speaking a word aloud. And because the risks were great, because discovery could lead to scandal or punishment, the very act of giving such gifts made them all the more precious, for in those quiet exchanges lay both vulnerability and daring. It is easy to underestimate these small gestures, but in a world where so much of life was dictated by duty, hierarchy, and control, these simple acts of tenderness provided a rare space where individuals could assert their own desires, however cautiously. They remind us that love has never been solely about grand declarations or dramatic choices. Sometimes it lives in the smallest details, in the folding of fabric, in the passing of a trinket, in the way two people can transform an ordinary object into a vessel for extraordinary feeling. In this way, tokens of love became not only the currency of romance, but also quiet acts of resistance, proving that even in the strictest of societies, the human heart always found ways to speak. Yet, even as these quiet tokens of affection passed from hand to hand, such moments of intimacy were rarely left unguarded. For medieval society was deeply concerned with appearances, reputation, and the preservation of virtue. And so the presence of chaperones became almost inevitable whenever unmarried men and women found themselves in close proximity. Far from being a casual precaution, this watchful supervision was a central part of social life, ensuring that no inappropriate whisper, stolen glance, or fleeting touch might cross the invisible boundaries set by custom and morality. A young woman of good family, whether noble or modest, could scarcely expect to meet with a suitor without the presence of a mother, an aunt, or a trusted servant nearby, their eyes sharp and their ears tuned to the slightest hint of impropriety. In the bustling marketplace, in the shaded cloisters of a churchyard, or even within the safety of her own home, the would-be lovers were never truly alone, for the gaze of the chaperone acted as both shield and barrier, shielding her from suspicion and gossip, yet also barring the path to genuine privacy. To attempt an unsupervised meeting was to court disaster, for it would invite scandal that could easily ruin reputations and jeopardize the careful plans that families had constructed around marriage and alliances. This constant presence could make even the simplest interaction feel charged with tension. A gentleman might attempt to express admiration through polite conversation, carefully weighing each word, while the watchful companion sat just a breath away, ready to step in should the exchange drift to near the boundaries of impropriety. A smile held 1,000 meanings. A pause between phrases carried the weight of possibility, yet every gesture was tempered by the awareness that nothing went unseen. It was a theater in which lovers played their parts with skill, their dialogue restrained and their longing hidden beneath layers of courtesy, while the chaperone served as both audience and warden. And yet, paradoxically, this scrutiny often heightened the drama of courtship rather than extinguished it. For what could not be openly said became more alluring when veiled in suggestion. And what could not be openly done gained significance when attempted under careful watch. A man might press a gift into a woman's hand when her guardian turned away for an instant. Or a woman might allow her admirer to walk beside her on a pilgrimage path, trusting that his silent company would speak louder than words ever could. In such moments, the chaperone's vigilance only added to the sense of daring, transforming simple acts into bold declarations of devotion. Thus, the ever-present figure of the chaperone shaped not only the rules of medieval romance, but also its very flavor, creating a world where love was defined as much by what was forbidden as by what was allowed, where every interaction became a careful negotiation between desire and decorum. And while it might seem stifling to us today for those who lived within its boundaries, this constant watchfulness made the pursuit of affection all the more intricate, delicate, and unforgettable, because the watchful presence of chaperones left so little room for privacy. Those determined to nurture affection had to rely on subtle networks of trust, and this is where servants, messengers, and even wandering minstrels entered the hidden world of medieval romance. They became the silent lifelines of love, carrying whispered words and delicate objects across thresholds that lovers themselves could not cross. And while their role may seem humble, in truth it demanded courage, loyalty, and no small amount of discretion. For discovery could mean disgrace for the sender, scandal for the recipient, and punishment for the go-between. A handmaid might tuck a folded piece of parchment into the hem of her gown, slipping it quietly into her lady's chamber when the household slept. Or she might conceal a Tacona small brooch, a sprig of rosemary, a lock of hair bound with thread within a basket of bread or fruit delivered under the guise of daily errands. In noble courts, trusted pages or attendants often found themselves entrusted with far more than errands of service, for they became the carriers of longing, ferrying verses of poetry or the faint scent of perfume clinging to a ribbon. Objects so ordinary to an outsider, yet heavy with meaning for those whose hearts ached for connection. Minstrels, too, sometimes played their part in this delicate game, their songs serving not only as entertainment, but also as coded messages with certain lines, melodies, or dedications slipping into the performance, like secret signals meant only for one pair of ears in the audience. A verse could be added, a glance sustained, a refrain repeated, and suddenly what seemed like a simple ballad became a private declaration woven into the public air, understood only by the one for whom it was intended. These moments blurred the line between art and conspiracy, transforming music into a vessel for affection that could travel undetected through the strictest of social barriers. Of course, these intermediaries lived with constant risk, for betrayal or a loose tongue could unravel even the most carefully woven secrecy. A servant discovered carrying a hidden letter might be dismissed, or beaten a minstrel whose words were too easily traced might be accused of impropriety. And yet the system persisted because the desire to express love, however dangerous, outweighed the fear of consequence. For those separated by duty, rank, or watchful eyes, the third party became more than a messenger. They were the bridge across which hope traveled, the unseen hand that allowed two people to maintain the fragile thread of their bond. What fascinates us now is not simply the ingenuity of these hidden exchanges, but the way they reveal how far individuals were willing to go to keep the spark of romance alive within such rigid confines. In a society where every move was observed and judged, the smallest act of rebellion, sending a note across a courtyard, pressing a trinket into the hand of a trusted servant, or embedding longing into a melody sung before a crowd, became monumental, a testament to the resilience of the human heart and its refusal to be silenced, no matter how strict the rules of the world around it. Among the many secret languages of love, few were as charming or as practical as the gift of food, for in an age when daily life was bound to the rhythms of hunger and harvest, the offering of something sweet or savory carried a meaning that went far beyond its taste. A warm meat pie wrapped in cloth and placed quietly into someone's hands was not only nourishment for the body, but also a signal of care, an unspoken way of saying, I thought of you. I wished to comfort you, and I dared to cross the invisible boundary that separates us. Likewise, a honey cake, golden and fragrant, could transform from a simple treat into a message of devotion, the sweetness of its flavor mirroring the sweetness of the sentiment that inspired its creation. Such gestures often unfolded in the most ordinary of settings, which only heightened their significance. A woman might send a servant to deliver a basket of pastries under the pretense of neighborly kindness. But within the carefully wrapped package lay the subtle promise of affection, understood only by the one who received it. A young man, perhaps lacking the means to offer fine jewelry or costly fabrics, might instead bake or procure a simple loaf flavored with herbs, trusting that the effort itself would reveal his sincerity. Even at feasts where tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats and spiced wine, a lover might deliberately choose a portion for another, sliding it across the table with a glance that carried far more meaning than the act itself suggested. To those on the outside, these exchanges appeared innocent acts of generosity, easily explained by custom or courtesy, yet to those who shared in them, the gesture was laden with intimacy, a small rebellion against the distance imposed by family, rank, or duty. Food, after all, was something that spoke to the senses directly. It required no parchment, no ink, no elaborate performance. It was tangible, immediate, and profoundly human, and because of this, it became one of the most effective ways to bridge the gap between lovers who could not openly speak their hearts. And while today we might think of romance in terms of flowers or jewelry in the medieval world, it was often these humble offerings that carried the deepest meaning. A sweet bite of honey, a savory crust filled with seasoned meat, or a carefully prepared cake tucked into a traveling pack could linger in memory far longer than the words that could never be spoken aloud. In giving food, lovers gave not only sustenance, but also comfort, trust, and the reassurance that someone cared enough to labor, to share, and to risk discovery for the sake of a fleeting moment of connection. In this way, the very act of offering nourishment became intertwined with the language of love, reminding us that in every age, romance has found its way not just into poetry and grand gestures, but also into the simplest of human needs, the desire to give, to receive, and to be remembered. Yet, for all the sweetness hidden in a gift of food or the thrill carried in a ribbon passed hand to hand, the risks of misstep were never far away. For, in the tightly woven fabric of a medieval village or town, reputation was as fragile as spun glass, and gossip traveled faster than the wind that rustled the thatched rooftops. A single misplaced glance, a touch held a moment too long, or a poorly timed word whispered when ears were listening could spark whispers that grew into tales, repeated by neighbors, by merchants at the market, by priests in sermons, until they became almost impossible to contain. It is easy to imagine a young woman blushing as she accepts a honey cake from a hopeful admirer, only to have the gesture noticed by a passing relative who carries the story home, reshaped, exaggerated, and whispered until the entire household is discussing what it might mean. Soon, the village well becomes an echo chamber, where women fetching water trade fragments of rumor, weaving them into narratives more dramatic than the truth ever was. What began as an innocent kindness might be retold as a secret courtship, a breach of family honor, or worse, a reckless act that could bring shame to an entire household. And gossip in these communities was not merely idle chatter. It could alter the course of lives. A family might begin to guard their daughter more closely, fearing that her reputation was being compromised. A suitor's chances could be ruined if he was painted as too forward, too reckless, or too eager, even if his intentions were genuine. In a world where alliances were built on honor and marriages were contracts of land and dowry, the stain of scandal could unravel negotiations and close doors that might otherwise have led to security and prosperity. Some tales spread in ways that bordered on cruel entertainment, with entire feasts buzzing with speculation about who had been seen exchanging a token or who had lingered too long in conversation after vespers. For the young and hopeful, these whispers could feel like daggers, each word turning private dreams into public theater. And once a story took root, no amount of denial or explanation could erase it entirely, for the memory of scandal clung stubbornly, surfacing months or even years later in sly remarks or knowing glances. Thus, every gesture carried a shadow of risk. Every token passed in secret was a gamble, and every word spoken in confidence might be repeated to ears that were never meant to hear it. Love in the Middle Ages was not only a matter of the heart, but also of vigilance, of careful navigation through a world where the line between devotion and disgrace was as thin as a thread. The lovers who dared to step into this realm of risk had to move with both courage and caution, aware that while affection could bring warmth to their lives, even a single miscalculation could set tongues wagging and alter their fate forever. For those fortunate enough to navigate the whispers of the village and the watchful eyes of family without stumbling into scandal, the journey toward partnership did not end with the thrill of secret glances or the daring exchange of tokens. What truly awaited was something far less romantic in appearance, yet far more enduring in its significance, for in the medieval world, a successful union was measured not by the fire of passion, but by the quiet resilience of two people learning to endure life together. Marriage, after all, was less a stage for love's dazzling spark than a workshop of daily survival, where affection had to adapt to the grinding rhythms of labor, duty, and hardship. Imagine a couple beginning their life not with the luxury of solitude, but with the immediate challenge of carving out a place within a household, a farm, or a community. The newly joined pair faced winters that gnawed at the bones, harvests that might fail, families that expected obedience, and neighbors who judged silently with every interaction. A marriage that thrived under such weight was one where husband and wife found ways to complement each other's strengths, to share burdens without keeping count, and to forgive the small irritations that daily closeness always breeds. Passion might inspire the union, but compatibility, patience, and endurance kept it alive. A husband who brought home firewood and food could not succeed without a wife who managed the hearth and the storehouse with equal diligence, and a wife who tended the animals and spun the wool would falter without a husband willing to barter, to mend, or to stand firm when disputes arose. Their bond was woven less through fiery declarations than through the 1,000 tiny acts of cooperation that allowed survival. A glance across the table while repairing tools, hand steadying another while lifting a heavy load, teasing a relief when a difficult season finally passed. These moments created a form of love that, though quieter, carried a depth beyond fleeting infatuation. Even in noble households where marriages were forged by contract and politics rather than personal choice, the measure of success came not from the pageantry of wedding feasts, but from the ability of the couple to function as allies within the treacherous currents of power and inheritance. A noblewoman who managed her estate with skill, who soothed disputes among vassals, and who provided heirs, earned respect not only as a wife, but as a partner indispensable to the survival of her family's standing. A nobleman who offered loyalty and protection while tempering ambition with prudence could ensure that his household thrived rather than fell into ruin. In this way, endurance became the true love story of the Middle Ages, one that unfolded not in the shadows of gardens or neath moonlit windows, but in kitchens filled with smoke and fields, muddy with labor, and in chambers where whispered plans for tomorrow replaced the fleeting poetry of yesterday. It was a love that demanded grit, patience, and the rare gift of acceptance, for only those who learned to endure each other's flaws and lean upon each other's strengths could hope to build a life capable of weathering the endless trials of their time. Building upon the idea that endurance and compatibility formed the true foundation of medieval unions, It is impossible to overlook the role of material exchanges that shaped not only the beginning of marriage, but often its very possibility. For beneath the tender gestures of affection and the quiet resilience of daily partnership lay the weight of contracts, negotiations, and transactions that turned marriage into both a personal commitment and a financial arrangement. These agreements varied from one region to another, but they always carried immense significance, for they determined not only the terms of union, but also the fate of families, estates, and futures. In some lands, the bride's family was expected to provide a dowry, a carefully assembled collection of wealth that might include coins, fine fabrics, livestock, or even parcels of land, handed over to ensure that the bride entered her new household not as a burden, but as a contributor to its prosperity. This dowry was not merely a gift. It was a statement of her family's standing, their ability to invest in the alliance, and their hope that the resources would secure her a respected place in her husband's home. To a daughter, the dowry was both a blessing and a burden, for while it elevated her chances of a favorable match, it also made her value measurable in tangible goods. Elsewhere, and particularly among communities where wealth was measured differently, the expectation turned to the groom's side, who offered a bride price to the family of the young woman he sought to marry. This payment was not simply the purchasing of a wife, though to modern eyes it might seem so. It was in truth a recognition of the labor, care, and resources her family had invested in her upbringing, a form of compensation meant to balance the loss of her presence within her natal household. For families who relied on every set of hands to tend fields, manage livestock, or carry water, the departure of a daughter was not just an emotional shift, but a practical one, and the bride price softened that loss. Noble households elevated these exchanges into matters of dynastic importance, with dowries stretching into staggering fortunes and bride prices tied to treaties or territorial claims. A single marriage contract could redraw maps, cement fragile alliances, or end generations of bloodshed. A chest of silver or a grant of land might mean the difference between prosperity and ruin, and families poured months, even years, into negotiating terms that would safeguard their legacy. Behind the gilded smiles of a wedding feast, one could often find contracts inked with more care than the vows spoken aloud. For those agreements carried the real power to bind two families together, even among villagers where fortunes were humbler and the gifts might be as modest as a few animals or a parcel of fertile soil. The principle remained the same. A marriage was not only the union of two people, but the weaving together of two households. In every case, the weight of wealth in exchange pressed upon the romance, reminding all involved that love alone was rarely enough to seal a union in the medieval world. Instead, survival and security demanded that affection be braided tightly with obligation, turning every vow into both a promise of companionship and a contract of mutual benefit. While contracts, dowries, and carefully negotiated alliances shaped the expected path to matrimony, there were always those who chose to step outside the boundaries of duty and tradition, risking everything for the dangerous allure of love, unfettered by obligation. In a world where marriage was so deeply entangled with wealth, politics, and family honor, an elopement was more than a private rebellion. It was a spark that could ignite conflicts reaching far beyond the couple themselves. To flee with one's beloved in secret, without parental consent or the blessing of the church, was to defy the very institutions that kept medieval society stable, and the consequences of such defiance could ripple through villages, towns, and even kingdoms, or the families left behind. An elopement was not simply an act of romance, but a public humiliation, stain upon their reputation. And in noble households, where every union carried the weight of alliances and inheritances, it could be nothing less than a political betrayal. Imagine the outrage of a powerful lord who had spent months securing a marriage contract for his daughter, only to learn that she had vanished in the night with a penniless knight, or a poet whose only fortune lay in his words. Such acts could unravel treaties, sever trade agreements, and even provoke feuds that simmered for generations. For in the medieval world, love without sanction was seen as a direct challenge to order itself. Yet the lovers who chose this perilous path were not always reckless dreamers, blinded by passion. Some were driven by desperation, escaping arranged unions that promised misery, while others sought to claim their right to a bond built on affection rather than duty. The image of two figures stealing away under cover of darkness hearts, pounding as they crossed forests, rivers, or city walls, carries with it both the thrill of forbidden desire and the terror of what awaited should they be caught. For punishment could be severe, ranging from disinheritance and social exile to violent reprisals carried out by enraged kin determined to restore their honor. The church, too, viewed elopements with suspicion, for they bypassed the sacred oversight that gave marriage legitimacy in the eyes of God. Without proper witnesses, bans, and blessings, a union forged in secret risked being declared invalid, leaving a couple vulnerable to annulment and their children branded illegitimate. And yet, despite the threats, elopements persisted, whispered about in taverns and immortalized in ballads sung by wandering minstrels, who turned acts of defiance into tales of tragic beauty. These stories of lovers who placed their hearts above the chains of duty stirred both admiration and fear, for they reminded society that beneath the weight of contracts and customs, the yearning for freedom and self-chosen love could never be fully extinguished. If the daring act of elopement represented the defiance of custom, then the marriages of the nobility embodied its strictest and most calculated form. For within the walls of castles and manor halls, matrimony was rarely about tender devotion and far more about the preservation of lineage, the securing of land, and the careful weaving of alliances that could determine the fate of entire realms. To be born into a noble household meant inheriting not only privilege but also responsibility, and for sons and daughters alike. The choice of a spouse was seldom theirs to make, for every union was a thread in a vast political tapestry designed to strengthen a family's position within the intricate hierarchy of medieval society. A noble daughter might grow up under the watchful gaze of her parents, knowing that her hand in marriage was less a matter of her heart's desire and more a bargaining chip in negotiations that could span months or even years. Lands bordering one another might be united through her. Dowry rival families long at odds might lay aside their feuds with her wedding vows, and her very presence in a new household could mean the difference between peace and renewed conflict. In this world, her smile at the altar was less a reflection of joy than a performance of duty, for behind her stood the weight of her family's future. Noble sons, too, bore the pressure of expectation, for marriage was not simply about acquiring a wife, but about securing influence, wealth, and power that would sustain their lineage. A union with a wealthy heiress could bring desperately needed coin into coffers strained by war or mismanagement, while a bride from a powerful dynasty could open doors to positions at court, military alliances, or claims to disputed lands. The nobleman's choice, if indeed it could be called his, was scrutinized not for affection but for advantage, and once sealed, the marriage became a contract in which personal happiness was often a distant consideration, if not entirely irrelevant. And yet, within these carefully arranged matches, life did not always unfold as bleakly as it might seem. While love was not the foundation upon which noble marriages were built, affection sometimes blossomed over time, nurtured by shared responsibilities and the quiet companionship of long years spent together. Others, however, found themselves trapped in cold and loveless unions, where partners lived as strangers beneath the same roof, each preoccupied with their own duties, ambitions, or private passions pursued beyond the boundaries of marriage. The stakes for these unions were immense. A failed marriage could fracture alliances, squander lands, or leave heirs disputed, sparking wars that engulfed entire regions. Success, on the other hand, could elevate a family's fortunes for generations, weaving their name into the annals of history. In this way, the noble marriage was less a private affair between two individuals and more a public contract upon which rested the delicate balance of medieval power, making each vow a declaration not of love, but of loyalty to one's bloodline and the relentless demands of survival in a world where land and legacy mattered above all. Though noble unions and village marriages alike often carried the weight of duty rather than the lightness of affection, life within those bonds did not always unfold with harmony, and when joy failed to take root, couples were left with few choices other than to endure. Divorce was nearly impossible, annulments were rare, and separation brought with it stigma and hardship. So unhappiness had to be managed in ways that rarely erupted into open conflict, yet simmered constantly beneath the surface of daily life. In such circumstances, the art of survival within an unhappy marriage was not one of passion, but of subtle resistance, quiet gestures, and the kind of endurance that became second nature to those bound by vows they could not easily break. In the dim rooms of peasant cottages, where families lived in close quarters, an unhappy couple might avoid one another by burying themselves in work, the husband lingering in the fields long after the day's tasks were done, the wife pouring her energy into the ceaseless demands of the hearth, and children each retreating into their labor as both shield and refuge. Words might be exchanged only when necessary, and conversations laced with small barbs or cold silences replaced the tenderness that once may have been there. Even the simplest acts, like the passing of bread across a table, could carry unspoken tension, an invisible reminder of promises that had soured but could not be undone. Among the nobility, where public appearances demanded a performance of unity, the strain of an unhappy marriage often played out behind closed doors. A lord might withhold affection by retreating to hunting lodges or campaigns, while his lady expressed her discontent through cool politeness, a subtle stiffening of the shoulders, or a smile that never reached her eyes during feasts and ceremonies. Letters were sometimes written not with warmth, but with calculated restraint, every word carrying layers of meaning that outsiders would never guess. These small acts of defiance, though seemingly insignificant, allowed individuals to assert fragments of autonomy in relationships that otherwise gave them little room for choice. Yet, what is most striking is not the bitterness itself, but the endurance that accompanied it. For many, life was too precarious to allow unhappiness to topple the structures that sustained survival. Children needed raising, land required tending, reputations demanded preservation, and in a society where community scrutiny was constant, its performance of stability mattered as much as the reality. And so, husbands and wives often learned to carry their grievances like hidden stones in their pockets, heavy but bearable, turning daily life into a balancing act between silent resentment and quiet perseverance. Over time, such endurance became its own form of strength. While love may not have blossomed in these unions, familiarity and routine could sometimes soften sharp edges, and even in marriages strained by disappointment, couples occasionally found a kind of companionship forged not through joy, but through the shared act of surviving side by side. It was, in many ways, the medieval answer to an inescapable truth. When happiness could not be chosen, resilience had to be cultivated, and in that resilience lay the capacity to endure even the coldest of bonds. Endurance, however, was not only the burden of those locked in unhappy unions. It was also the reality faced by those who outlived their spouses, for widowhood in the medieval world carried its own trials, opportunities, and disputes. To lose a husband or wife was to step suddenly into a liminal space, one in which grief collided with practical concerns, and where the future often hinged not on emotion, but on the negotiation of dowries, inheritances, and obligations owed to families on both sides. So far from a quiet retreat into mourning, widowhood frequently thrust men and women alike into the center of contention for property, wealth, and power became the battlegrounds upon which their next chapter would be determined. For women, widowhood was a double-edged condition. On one hand, it granted a measure of independence that married life rarely allowed, freeing them from the immediate authority of a husband. Yet, that independence was fragile, for a widow's security often depended on how her dowry and inheritance were managed. If her late husband's family laid claim to her property, disputes could drag on through manorial courts, with every cousin or in-law seeking their share. Some widows found themselves embroiled in bitter quarrels over land or livestock, their futures hanging on the outcome of legal arguments they had little power to shape. Others, however, emerged from these negotiations with enough resources to carve out a degree of autonomy, running small estates, managing businesses, or choosing whether and to whom they would remarry. Remarriage, in turn, was seldom a simple matter of affection. Before a widow could enter into another union, her dowry had to be settled, her husband's debts accounted for, and her children's inheritances secured. Families on both sides watched closely, ensuring that wealth did not slip into the wrong hands. A widow who brought with her a considerable estate or generous dowry could suddenly become a highly desirable match, courted not for her youth or beauty, but for the power and resources she represented. For some, this attention offered a path to improved status and security. For others, it meant being pulled once more into the web of duty and negotiation that had defined their first marriage. Among noble families, these negotiations could become fierce, for the remarriage of a wealthy widow carried immense political weight. A countess or duchess left without a husband was rarely allowed to remain so for long, for her lands were too valuable to be left unattached, and suitors, often chosen more by her kin than by her own desire, lined up to claim her hand and, through it, her holdings. In such cases, a widow's mourning was swiftly overshadowed by the bargaining of men eager to bind her estate to their lineage. And yet, in rare instances, these very circumstances allowed noble women to exert influence otherwise denied to them. For as widows, they could negotiate, resist, or even manipulate the terms of their remarriages with a skill born of necessity. In villages, too, widowhood reshaped social roles. A woman left without a husband might return to her natal family, or she might attempt to maintain her household independently, hiring laborers or relying on the help of grown children. A widower, meanwhile, often faced pressure to remarry quickly, for without a wife to manage the household, his survival could be jeopardized. In both cases, the negotiation of resources dictated their fates, proving that widowhood was never a passive state, but a turbulent passage through which property, reputation, and resilience were tested in equal measure, even as the negotiations of dowries, inheritances, and remarriages revealed the practical and often contentious side of love. There remained another current running through medieval life, one less tangible, but no less powerful. Alongside the careful contracts of noble households and the whispered gossip of village streets, romance carried with it a layer of belief that blurred the boundary between devotion and the mystical, weaving superstition into the fabric of courtly love and personal affection. For in an age when the natural world was filled with signs and omens, the pursuit of love was rarely imagined without the unseen hand of fate, fortune, or even forces beyond the earthly realm. A knight who pledged himself to his lady did so not only through poetry and gallant service, but sometimes through charms, talismans, or whispered prayers meant to ensure that his devotion would be returned. Lovers exchanged not only tokens like ribbons or gloves, but also trinkets believed to carry protective power stones gathered under a full moon, herbs said to stir desire, or rings inscribed with words that blurred the line between prayer and spell. In a world where science had not yet explained the mysteries of the heart or the body, people turned to superstition to make sense of the uncertainty that surrounded romance, believing that fate itself could be nudged by ritual and symbol. Women, too, sought guidance from mystical traditions when navigating love. Some turned to fortune tellers or wise women of the village, asking whether their suitor was faithful, whether a marriage would prosper, or whether affection would last beyond the first bloom. The alignment of stars, the flight of birds, or even the way wax dripped from a candle could be read as signs pointing toward joy or heartbreak. These practices, though never officially sanctioned by the church, were quietly woven into the rhythms of daily life, offering hope and reassurance in matters that could never be fully controlled. Among nobles, courtly love itself often carried an air of the mystical, for the very language of devotion was steeped in notions of transcendence, as though the beloved were less a human figure than a spiritual ideal. Poems likened desire to divine longing, and troubadours sang of women as if they were saints upon altars, blending earthly romance with almost religious reverence. This blending of love and mysticism created a space where affection could be imagined as both a deeply personal experience and a reflection of forces larger than human will. Superstitious beliefs also played a role in the fears that accompanied romance. A scorned lover might be suspected of casting a curse. A broken promise could be blamed on evil spirits, and sudden illness or misfortune in courtship was sometimes explained as the work of unseen powers. In this way, love was never a simple exchange of hearts, but a delicate dance with the unknown, where hope and fear intertwined in equal measure. Thus, romance in the medieval world existed not only in the realm of whispered words and stolen glances, but also in the unseen dimension of signs, charms, and mystical beliefs. It was a world where courtly poetry and village superstition coexisted, where every vow carried with it not just the promise of affection, but the weight of fate, and where love was as much a spiritual journey as it was a human bond. While courtly love and mystical beliefs painted romance with the brushstrokes of poetry and superstition, the medieval world was never solely the domain of passive maidens waiting in towers or wives confined to the hearth. History is scattered with the names and deeds of women who stepped far beyond the boundaries society prescribed for them, women whose lives became living proof that agency and power could emerge in the most unexpected of forms. Stories such as that of Thomius, though often shrouded in legend and filtered through the biases of chroniclers, illuminate a side of medieval womanhood that was fierce, commanding, and unafraid to grasp leadership even in the face of war and turmoil. Thomius, and others like her, stand as figures who defied the quiet roles expected of them, taking on responsibilities that were traditionally the realm of men, in times when kingdoms trembled under the threat of invasion or when succession hung in the balance. These women rose not only as symbols of endurance, but as strategists, warriors, and rulers in their own right. Chroniclers record them rallying armies, negotiating alliances, and holding fortresses against overwhelming odds. Their presence on the battlefield or within the council chamber challenging the notion that authority was strictly a masculine domain. Their stories remind us that even in a world deeply structured by patriarchal norms, cracks existed where determination, intelligence, and sheer will could shine through. What makes these accounts so compelling is the way they intertwine the personal with the political. A woman like Thomius did not act in isolation. She carried with her the weight of family honor, the survival of her people, and the fragile threads of loyalty that bound medieval societies together. Her decisions in war or leadership often determined not only her own fate, but the fates of hundreds who looked to her for protection. And yet, behind every tactical maneuver and every act of courage, there lingers the image of a human being forced to navigate the same struggles of love, duty, and endurance that shaped the lives of countless women less remembered by history. The tales of such figures also reveal how deeply intertwined gender and power could be. While many women were silenced by circumstance, those who emerged into prominence bent societal expectations to their will, using wit, diplomacy, and sometimes sheer audacity to carve out authority. Their stories blurred the lines between the expected and the possible, proving that female agency was not a rare miracle, but a recurring thread, though one too often overshadowed by the grand narratives of kings and knights. In listening to the echoes of these women's lives, one can see how the medieval world, for all its rigid hierarchies, still allowed space, however narrow, for extraordinary individuals to alter its course. And though their stories were often recorded reluctantly, or later embellished into legend, they endure as reminders that power in the Middle Ages was not the sole preserve of men, and that even in the most turbulent of times, women could rise to command respect, inspire loyalty, and leave an indelible mark on history. And among these figures who stood defiantly against the tide of history, few stories shine as fiercely as that of Thomius, the nomadic queen whose courage and cunning changed the fate of empires. She was no ruler cloaked in silk within marble palaces, nor a sovereign propped up by courtly ceremony. Thomius led her people from the open steppe, a land where survival depended on quick judgment, resilience, and unyielding strength. It was from this harsh landscape that she rose to confront one of the most formidable conquerors the ancient world had ever known. Cyrus the Great of Persia. Cyrus had swept across vast territories with a reputation that made entire kingdoms tremble at the mere whisper of his name. His armies had toppled dynasties. His banners had been planted in cities thought unconquerable, and his power seemed unstoppable. Yet, when he turned his gaze toward the lands of Thomius and her people, he underestimated not only their determination, but the brilliance of the queen who led them. For Thomius, the conflict was not born of ambition or desire for expansion, but of survival, vengeance, and the fierce protection of her people. When her son was taken by the Persians and lost in their captivity, grief transformed into resolve, and what might have been a defensive struggle became an oath of retribution. She was not content to grieve in silence or accept defeat. Instead, she mounted her horse, rallied her warriors, and prepared to meet Cyrus with both fury and strategy. Unlike the massive, disciplined armies of Persia, Thomius commanded riders who knew every contour of the plains. Warriors who could vanish into the horizon and strike with precision before their enemies could even raise a shield. The battle that followed was more than a clash of swords and spears. It was a contest between imperial power and nomadic will. Cyrus came armed with the confidence of countless victories, yet Thomius fought with a different weapon: the knowledge of the land and the unwavering loyalty of her people. Through clever tactics and relentless courage, she turned the tide against the Persians, leading her warriors into a confrontation that would end not only in victory, but in the death of Cyrus himself. His fall at her hands sent shockwaves across the ancient world, for here was a queen without palaces or fortresses, commanding no empire but her own. And yet, she had accomplished what few dared even to imagine. She had brought down one of history's greatest conquerors. Thomius's triumph was not celebrated with monuments carved in stone or cities renamed in her honor, for her people left little behind but the songs and stories passed down through generations. Yet the absence of marble did not diminish the weight of her legacy. Her victory lived on in the chronicles of outsiders who could scarcely believe that a nomadic queen had defeated the mighty Cyrus, and her name endured because it carried with it the audacity to stand against impossible odds. In her story, we see not only the might of a warrior queen, but also the enduring truth that strategy, bravery, and unbreakable resolve can shatter even the grandest of empires. What made Thomius's rise even more remarkable was that within her society, unlike in the rigid hierarchies of great empires, women were not confined solely to the hearth or dismissed to the shadows of history. Among the nomadic peoples of the steppe, survival demanded that every member of the tribe contribute with strength and skill, and in such a world, women often stood shoulder to shoulder with men riding into battle, managing herds, negotiating alliances, and commanding respect, not through titles or inherited privilege, but through their ability to lead and endure. This contrasted sharply with the more settled kingdoms and empires of the ancient world, where women's lives were frequently bound within walls. their influence limited to whispers in the palace or the management of domestic affairs, while public power and military command were jealously guarded by men. For the nomads, mobility was survival, and with constant movement across unforgiving landscapes. Every capable hand was valued, every voice could shape decisions. And leadership was not an ornament of lineage, but a matter of proven worth. A woman like Tomius could ascend because her people recognized not just her noble birth, but her sharp judgment, her resilience, and her courage, qualities that in other societies might have been overlooked or even suppressed. It was within this context of practical equality, born out of necessity and sustained by custom, that women could emerge as warriors, healers, diplomats, and rulers, their identities never reduced to mere extensions of their husbands or fathers, but instead standing in their own right as forces of authority. Such freedoms did not mean that life was easier for women of the steppe. It was as demanding and harsh as the winds that swept across the plains, but it allowed for a vision of gender roles far more flexible than those in marble courts or fortified cities. And so, when Tamia stood against Cyrus, she did not do so as an anomaly or an exception to be hidden away, but as a representative of a tradition that recognized the power of women as integral to the survival and success of their people. It is in this light that her story becomes not merely the tale of a queen defying an empire, but a window into a society that, though often dismissed as barbarian by outsiders, carried within it a strikingly different balance of respect and agency between men and women. One that allowed legends like Tomius to rise and endure in memory long after empires crumbled into dust. Just as their lives were shaped by endless horizons and shifting seasons, the memory of nomadic peoples was carried not in stone inscriptions or written chronicles, but in the living voices of their communities, where stories, songs, and recitations became both archive and classroom. Around flickering campfires, under the vast night sky, elders would recount the deeds of ancestors, the triumphs and tragedies, oaths and rulers, and the laws that held their society together, even as they moved across thousands of miles of open land. These tales were more than entertainment. They were the binding threads of identity, ensuring that every child who listened absorbed not only the rhythm of words, but the responsibilities, values, and history of their people. Without parchment libraries or permanent capitals, oral tradition became the lifeblood of cultural survival, with each generation entrusted to carry the words forward like sacred treasure, refining the stories with memory yet holding true to their core meaning. Heroes like Tomius lived on not just because of their victories, but because their names were woven into songs and repeated in gatherings. Their strategies told as lessons in leadership, their bravery framed as models for both men and women to emulate. This way of remembering demanded active participation, for the spoken word required listeners who became future tellers, ensuring a constant cycle of renewal that written records could never replicate. It was an education that shaped minds without the walls of classrooms, where wisdom was carried not in books, but in hearts and tongues, and where to forget was to break the chain of belonging. To the nomads, history was alive, breathing in every performance, and law was not a distant decree, but a melody that everyone knew by heart. And so, even as outsiders dismissed them as primitive or unsophisticated, these cultures safeguarded a tradition of storytelling that gave them resilience, continuity, and a sense of unity that endured as fiercely as the warriors on horseback. In the same way that their stories flowed from one voice to the next, so too did the lives of nomadic peoples move with a rhythm that confounded their more settled neighbors. For their strength did not lie in stone walls or mapped borders, but in their adaptability in the many ways they wove survival into opportunity. One season might find them leading caravans heavy with furs, salt, or horses, exchanging goods across vast distances that connected distant civilizations. While another season could see those same riders sweeping down upon a rival camp or an undefended frontier, seizing wealth and resources with speed that no fortress could anticipate. Yet they were not merely raiders, for diplomacy was as important as warfare, and alliances forged through marriages, tribute, or shared enemies often gave them influence that rivaled kings and emperors, even though they held no permanent city to display their power. This flexibility was both their weapon and their shield, allowing them to vanish into endless steppes when threatened, to regroup and return stronger when opportunity arose, and to remain a presence that could never be fully subdued by conquest, because their power was not tied to monuments or fields, but to their people and their horses. In the eyes of empires, this made them both unpredictable and dangerous. 4 treaties signed with nomads might hold for a generation or dissolve overnight, depending on whether conditions favored trade or conflict. But within their own worldview, such adaptability was not instability, but wisdom. The recognition that survival required many paths, and that strength came from being able to shift seamlessly between negotiation, exchange, and force as the winds of fortune demanded. It was this blend of commerce, calculated aggression, and pragmatic alliance that allowed nomadic societies to exert pressure far beyond their numbers, to shape the destinies of empires without ever claiming the permanence of a capital or the static authority of walls. Their power was in motion, and in that motion lay a freedom that baffled outsiders and sustained them for centuries, making their presence felt on every frontier they touched. To understand the soul of the nomadic world, one must look not to temples of stone or sanctuaries carved into cliffs, but to the open expanse, of the steppe where the horizon stretched endlessly and the heavens arched above as both shelter and mystery. Their spirituality was not confined to walls or mediated by priests cloaked in ritual authority, but instead flowed naturally through the rhythm of the seasons, the migrations of herds, and the eternal dialogue between earth and sky. Every sunrise was a reminder of renewal, every storm a sign of power beyond human grasp, and every star a silent witness to lives that passed across the plains. To them, the sacred was not distant or abstract, but immediate and alive, present in the grass that fed their animals, in the rivers that quenched their thirst, and in the sky that offered both guidance and awe. The cycles of life and death, growth and decline, departure and return were understood as reflections of the larger cosmic order, and rituals were woven seamlessly into the fabric of survival. Offerings might be left upon a hilltop to honor spirits of the land, prayers whispered into the wind before a journey, or feasts shared in gratitude for the safe return of a herd. Shamans with their drums and chants served as bridges between the physical and the unseen, guiding their people through illness and certainty, in the mysteries of fate, not by separating sacred space from daily life, but by affirming that every breath, every step, every change of season carried spiritual meaning. This deep connection made their faith profoundly adaptive, as they could move across territories and yet remain spiritually grounded, for their gods were not bound to a single city or altar, but dwelled in the natural forces that traveled with them, where empires rooted their religions in monumental temples and rigid hierarchies. Nomads carried theirs in memory, song, and gesture, as fluid and enduring as the winds that swept the grasslands. And so, even as outsiders judged them as untamed or unrefined, their spirituality reflected a profound wisdom. That true strength lay in harmony with the cycles of nature, in that to honor the sky, the land, and the eternal rhythms of life was to recognize a sacred order far greater than any throne or empire could ever claim. Unlike in the courts of empires, where women were often hidden behind veils of protocol and confined to chambers far from the battlefield, in nomadic societies, the line between duty and gender was far less rigid, for survival demanded that every capable hand be ready to lead, fight, or guide the community forward. It was not a scandal for a woman to take the reins of leadership, nor was it shocking to see her mounted on horseback, with bow or spear in hand, for such actions were seen not as defiance of custom, but as fulfillment of responsibility. When danger approached a camp, or when alliances required sharp judgment, women could and did step into roles that in other cultures would have been unthinkable. Their authority recognized as a natural extension of their strength and wisdom, rather than an exception carved out of pity or necessity. Stories passed down through generations told of women who commanded warriors, who negotiated terms with rival tribes, and who fought fiercely in defense of their people. And these tales were not whispered as curiosities, but celebrated as part of the living memory of the steppe. Daughters learned early that they might one day be called upon to ride beside their brothers in battle, or to stand at the center of the camp and make decisions that would shape the fate of their kin. And this expectation was not framed as rebellion, but as honor. Leadership was measured not in gender, but in the ability to endure hardship, to inspire loyalty, and to safeguard the survival of the tribe. And in this sense, women could ascend to positions of respect as naturally as men, their voices carrying equal weight when it came to survival and strategy. This blending of roles gave nomadic women a kind of agency rarely seen in settled kingdoms, where the strict divisions of palace and battlefield locked them into narrower paths. Among the tribes of the steppe, however, power was flexible, drawn from capability and necessity, in the image of a woman leading her people, riding with the wind in her hair and the weight of command in her voice, was neither myth nor fantasy, but a reflection of the practical and deeply rooted values that defined their world. In honoring such women, nomadic cultures demonstrated that strength came not only from the sword or the crown, but also from the ability to adapt, to share burdens, and to recognize leadership wherever it arose, regardless of gender. The thunder of hooves across the steppe eventually finds its echoes centuries later in the thunder of iron wheels rolling across the vast expanse of the American continent, where the dream of progress and the hunger for expansion forged a new kind of frontier. The arrival of the railroad did more than carry passengers from one town to another. It reshaped entire landscapes, carving paths through mountains, stretching rails across prairies, and binding together regions that had once felt impossibly distant. Villages that had been little more than quiet outposts suddenly found themselves humming with commerce, their dusty streets filling with merchants, laborers, and travelers whose very presence brought both opportunity and disruption. Towns rose almost overnight along the lines, their fortunes tied to the schedules of locomotives, while others, bypassed by the rails, withered into obscurity, left behind by the relentless march of steel and steam. The railroad was not merely a line of transport, but the backbone of a new economic order stitching together farms, factories, and markets into an interdependent network that fueled growth on a scale the young nation had never seen before. Goods that once took weeks or months to reach distant buyers now arrived in days, accelerating trade and inviting waves of settlers westward with promises of prosperity. At the same time, landscapes were forever altered. Valleys echoed with the calls of whistles. Forests were cut back to clear paths, and wide rivers that had long been crossed only by ferry gave way to bridges of iron, each structure a monument to human ambition. The presence of the rails transformed not only geography, but also imagination, for they made the vastness of America feel smaller, more connected, and yet, paradoxically, more divided. As the speed of change unsettled traditions and disrupted the balance of older ways of life. This transformation was both a triumph and upheaval, a story of progress marked equally by opportunity and loss. For a while, the railroad bound the nation together in steel threads. It also deepened the contrasts between the booming towns of the tracks and the fading silence of those left beyond their reach. It was a revolution, not just of movement, but of identity. for the people who lived along those lines was swept into a new rhythm of time measured now by train schedules instead of sunrises, a new vision of destiny, one that promised greatness but demanded sacrifice. Yet, behind the gleaming image of locomotives racing across the horizon lay the back-breaking toil of thousands whose sweat and sacrifice made such triumphs possible. Men who carved pathways through wilderness and mountains with little more than muscle grit and determination. Among them were the countless immigrant laborers, especially the Chinese workers, who became the unheralded backbone of the transcontinental dream, facing not only the relentless demands of the landscape, but also the indifference and prejudice of the society that employed them. They swung hammers in blistering heat beneath the desert sun, drove spikes through frozen ground in winters that froze skin to metal, and balanced precariously on cliff faces where one misstep could mean a fall into the abyss. All for wages that were often lower and conditions harsher than those endured by their counterparts of European descent. Entire crews spent months in isolation, blasting tunnels through granite with little more than black powder, shoveling snow to clear avalanches that threatened to bury the rails, or laying ties across miles of prairie where storms rolled without warning. Camps were crude and food was scarce, yet discipline and resilience kept the work moving forward. For to falter was to be replaced, and to endure meant survival in the slim hope of a better future. The stories of these men rarely reached the headlines that celebrated progress, yet their presence was etched into every mile of track, every bridge that spanned a river, every tunnel that pierced the mountains. They bore the weight of history on their shoulders, even as they were denied acknowledgement in the moment, treated as expendable laborers rather than as builders of a nation's destiny. And still, they persevered, their endurance becoming as much a part of the railroad as the iron itself. For it was their determination that turned the impossible into the inevitable. The triumph of the Transcontinental Railroad was not simply the victory of visionaries and financiers, but the collective achievement of those who endured hunger, exhaustion, and danger in the name of progress. Their names often forgotten, but their legacy carved forever into the steel lines that bound a continent together. The lines of steel that stretched across the continent did more than connect towns and carry passengers. They became the arteries through which the lifeblood of a new industrial age flowed, pumping coal, lumber, grain, and manufactured goods across vast distances with a speed that earlier generations could scarcely imagine. With the shriek of a whistle and the steady rhythm of iron wheels, factories found markets far beyond their local reach. Farmers gained access to distant cities where their harvests could be sold, and settlers were drawn ever deeper into territories that had once seemed unreachable. Their wagons replaced by rail cars, and their journeys shortened from months to mere days. Towns that sprouted along the tracks grew into bustling cities, and industries that depended on rapid transport flourished in ways that reshaped the entire economic landscape of America. But the relentless advance of the rails also brought with it shadows that could not be ignored, for as settlers poured westward in greater numbers, the balance of the natural world was disrupted in ways that would prove irreversible. Perhaps nothing illustrates this more starkly than the fate of the great buffalo herds, which for centuries had roamed the plains in uncountable numbers, sustaining the cultures and economies of indigenous peoples who lived in harmony with their migrations. The arrival of the railroad turned the buffalo into targets of opportunity. Their massive bodies felled not just for hides and meat, but often for sport, with hunters firing from train windows as herds thundered across the prairie. Within a single generation, animals once so plentiful that the earth seemed to move beneath their hooves were reduced to near extinction, and with their disappearance came devastation for the native nations whose lives were inseparable from these creatures. Thus, the story of the railroad is not one of unbroken triumph, but of profound transformation, where the same steel tracks that fueled industrial growth and open horizons also hastened the destruction of ecosystems accelerated the displacement of indigenous peoples and marked the end of an era in which the natural rhythms of the land held sway. Progress carried with it both promise and loss, binding together a nation even as it unraveled ways of life that it endured for centuries, leaving behind a legacy as complex as the land it crossed. The gleaming tracks that cut across prairies and mountains came to symbolize far more than transportation, for they carried with them the weight of a national belief that it was America's divine mission to expand westward, to spread settlements, industry, and influence from ocean to ocean. Each new mile of rail seemed to validate the ideology of manifest destiny, reinforcing the conviction that the continent is destined to be bound together under one flag its lands, harnessed for progress, and its peoples, whether settlers, immigrants, or indigenous nations, swept into the current of a single national story. Newspapers and politicians alike hailed the railroad as proof of providence fulfilled, as evidence that ambition and technology were the very instruments by which destiny was written in iron and steam. But while the language of destiny cloaked the expansion in lofty ideals, the rails also became instruments of power wielded by corporations whose influence began to shape American life in profound and lasting ways. Railroad companies grew into behemoths that commanded vast sums of money, controlled entire swaths of land granted by the government, and dictated the economic fortunes of towns, farms, and factories tied to their lines. Rates could lift a community into prosperity or doom it to isolation, and decisions made in corporate offices far from the frontier reverberated across households that depended on access to markets. In many ways, the power of these companies surpassed that of local governments, for they held in their hands the means to accelerate growth or to strangle it, and with such control came corruption, speculation, and bitter disputes that would spark outrage among farmers, small businesses, and laborers alike. Thus, the railroad stood at the intersection of ideology and enterprise, embodying both the soaring vision of a nation fulfilling its supposed destiny and the sobering reality of unchecked corporate influence that defined much of America's Gilded Age. The steel tracks were not simply pathways across the land. They were avenues through which ambition, greed, hope, and power traveled together, weaving progress with inequality and leaving behind a legacy as contested as the very land they traversed. Seen through the lens of the railroads and the people who built, resisted, and relied upon them, one cannot escape the deeper truth that history itself is often a stage where individual longings, collective rules, and the raw need to survive are set against one another in constant tension. The settlers who boarded trains heading west carried with them dreams of prosperity, freedom, and new beginnings, yet those desires often clashed with laws meant to regulate land, commerce, or cultural boundaries, and at the same time collided with the unforgiving realities of drought, debt, or displacement. Railroad magnates envisioned empires of steel and profit, chasing personal ambition with ruthless determination. But their vision pressed against social demands for fairness, regulation, and accountability, while survival for countless ordinary families depended on whether those rails brought opportunity or ruin. Even indigenous peoples whose lives were appended by the advance of the tracks found themselves forced into impossible choices, torn between defending traditions and adapting to systems imposed upon them, navigating a world where survival sometimes meant resistance and sometimes meant compromise. This recurring struggle was not unique to the age of railroads. It is a pattern etched into the flow of history, where every era reveals the same uneasy balance between what individuals want, what society demands, and what life itself requires. Medieval lovers courted in whispers, while chaperones enforced rules of propriety. Nomadic queens, like Timaeus, seized power in ways their contemporaries accepted as natural, even while empires dismissed them as anomalies, and workers in the shadow of the Gilded Age labored in brutal conditions to chase dreams. that the very structures of power sought to restrain. Across time and place, the drama unfolds with familiar rhythms, passion and ambition pushing outward, laws and customs pulling inward, and the relentless necessity of survival forcing choices that leave behind both triumph and tragedy. What the railroad era makes clear just as the medieval court, the nomadic steppe, or the battlefield of empire once did is that history is not a neat progression of victories and failures, but a tapestry woven from the interplay of human desire, collective order, and the strategies people devise to endure. It is in these frictions that civilizations are tested, cultures transformed, and legacies written, leaving us to wonder how future generations will view the struggles of our own time, and whether the rails we lay today are carrying us toward fulfillment, conflict, or some complex mixture of both. The patterns that weave through history remind us that, though centuries and continents apart, human beings have always lived within the same tangled web of longing, duty, and survival. In the medieval world, love was rarely simple. It unfolded through elaborate codes of conduct, where courtly love meant whispered poetry and carefully exchanged ribbons, where marriage was more often a negotiation of wealth and land than of hearts, and where passion had to find expression in symbols, tokens, and stories passed in secret. Romance existed, but it wore the mask of performance, bound by rules that ensured every gesture carried weight. Every misstep risked gossip, and every union was as much about endurance as desire. The image of lovers sneaking honeycakes into one another as hands or slipping a cloak reveals both the restraint and the creativity of people living under rigid social scrutiny, and it underscores that even then individuals carved out spaces for affection in a world determined to regulate their hearts. Yet, if medieval love was constrained by propriety and duty, the steppe nomads remind us that different societies allow for different possibilities. Tomius, the formidable queen who faced Cyrus the Great with courage and cunning, embodied a form of female power that did not need to hide behind veils of secrecy or symbolic tokens. Among nomadic peoples, women could command troops, direct alliances, and act as arbiters of law and culture. Their influence preserved not in dusty manuscripts, but in the oral traditions that bound generations together. Here, romance and leadership were not mutually exclusive, and female strength was not a violation of social norms, but an expression of them. Nomadic spirituality, tied to the sky above and the earth beneath, infused every act with sacred meaning, shaping a worldview where cycles of life and death echoed in the stories sung by bards and whispered by firesides. Trade, raiding, and diplomacy became extensions of survival, and the fluidity of nomadic life meant that love, power, and spirituality were not confined by walls, but carried across plains and deserts in the rhythms of movement. Centuries later, the story shifted once again as steel rails cut through the American landscape, carving paths that redefined what survival and ambition meant for millions. The railroad era brought dreams of expansion and industry, but it was built on the backs of laborers who endured bitter winters in the mountains and scorching summers in the plains. Chinese workers, Irish immigrants, and countless others laid tracks under conditions that tested the limits of human endurance, forging connections that would forever alter the geography of commerce and settlement. The trains that thundered west carried settlers seeking land, fortune, and opportunity, but they also carried the seeds of destruction for the great buffalo herds and the displacement of indigenous nations. The dream of manifest destiny, wrapped in the rhetoric of progress and national purpose, was as much about profit and corporate power as it was about ideals of unity, binding together a nation with iron at the cost of countless lives, ecosystems, and cultures. Across these different chapters, medieval courts, nomadic steppes, and railroad frontiers, one sees a shared human story of negotiation between what people desired, what societies demanded, and what survival required. Medieval lovers longed for intimacy, but lived within strict codes that forced them to be patient and discreet. Nomadic queens could step into leadership without undermining their societies, proving that gender roles were never fixed, but instead products of cultural landscapes. Railroad builders and settlers reached for prosperity, only to discover that opportunity often came shadowed by exploitation, conflict, and loss. In each of these worlds, human beings struggled to reconcile ambition with restraint, passion with duty, and hope with hardship. History, then, is not simply a collection of distant events, but a mirror in which we can see ourselves. The details change whether it is a ribbon slipped into a hand, a warrior queen raising her sword, or a whistle echoing across the plains, but the essence remains familiar. We are creatures of desire, shaped by the rules we inherit, tested by the need to survive, and always searching for meaning in the choices we make. Perhaps the lesson of these stories is that while we cannot escape the tension between longing, law, and necessity, we can recognize in it the humanity that links us across time. And so, as we close this journey through the loves, battles, and railways of history, let us remember that every age carries its own struggles and its own beauty, and that by listening to these echoes, we may find wisdom for our own lives. Thank you for staying with this story. May your dreams tonight be filled with wonder, and may you rest peacefully. Good night.